On this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, we speak with Oracle on NFV news coming out of this year's Mobile World Congress event. All right, well, thanks for joining us on this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. And this week, we are joined by Chris King, who's the Senior Director of CSP Products at Oracle, talk a bit about the NFV space and kind of where we are in terms of the ongoing development and deployment of NFV technologies by telecom operators. So Chris, thanks for joining us again. We always appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here, Dan. It's always great to talk to you.
Very good. Well, I know we talked probably 6 months ago, right around that time, and I think we've talked a bit about the virtualization space several times. But I guess maybe start off with, what's your general view in terms of kind of what's been happening in the NFV space over the past 6 months or so? Maybe any sort of advances you've seen, any sort of kind of good successes, maybe hurdles that have kind of come and gone in terms of kind of the ongoing development and deployment of NFV by the telecom operators out there.
Yeah, it's been an interesting last 6 months, and we've been kind of, as an industry, we've been playing with NFV. Is probably the really the operative word up until middle of last year. Then I started to see people, service providers starting to get very real about it and starting to make their first, real production at scale deployments. Mm-hmm. And, last year was, again, just, a few here and there, obviously some of the bigger names really, making some real strides. This year, I think, is the year where we're going to see it go, really for the big operators. I think we're going to see NFV really start to go. Mm-hmm. And we'll start to see many of these visions become reality.
Interesting. I guess for last year, were there certain maybe challenges that were still kind of being worked through? Because it did seem like, I think there's still some issues or questions around standards and things like that. And open source obviously has a lot to do with a lot of this. But I guess was last year as expected, do you think, or did anything kind of crop up maybe that kind of maybe slowed things down at all? Or I guess what would you view on just, the timing of everything for last year?
Yeah. I think NFV is like many grand telecom initiatives. We've had a number of these over the decades. And, when they first come out, there's this great vision. We're going to do all of this tomorrow, and it's just going to be instant reality and nirvana. And the reality, after having been through this a few times, is it always takes a time to get through the complexities. Yeah. And NFV is no exception. And there are still complexities to be worked through. In particular, orchestration remains a significant challenge to NFV. I think we're starting to see real headway on virtualized network functions. Yeah. I think we're starting to see some initial capabilities around orchestration starting to really come to fruition. But it's all the stuff around the edges of orchestration that I think still need to be worked out. How does orchestration work with the rest of the OSS BSS estate? How does orchestration work with a hybrid network where aspects of it are virtualized and aspects aren't? Those kinds of challenges haven't completely been worked out. I do think open source has been a real attribute to a lot of the efforts in this area. But the reality is open source only gets you, once again, so far before you got to deploy this thing and work through the realities of turning this thing into a revenue-producing service.
That's a good point. I talked to somebody about this a couple of weeks ago at an event I was at, and they were saying that open source is great for getting you to the 20-yard line, to use the football analogy. But to go from that 20-yard line to the end zone, that's where the real work comes, and that's where the vendors and the carriers and everybody has to really work together and kind of figure out how to make this production ready, and for the telecom space, that whole carrier grade situation as well. That seems like that probably is still, maybe it sounds like that's still kind of a bit of a challenge at this point, is still getting those last 20 yards, those last 10 yards out there, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good metaphor. It's a little out of season, but
yeah, you're right.
It's a good metaphor. And I think one of the things that's maybe a little different about NFV from a lot of the earlier telecom initiatives is, in fact, open source, and the way open source is working with standards. And that interaction between open source and standards and allowing those two things to build on each other, I think is what's making NFV make it to the 20-yard line
Mm-hmm.
in this time frame. Yeah, we still got to get it from the 20 to the goal line, but we're pushing down the field. Progress is being made by the industry, and yeah, the hard part is the devil is always in the details, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, maybe a better analogy is it gets you to the Sweet 16. If you want to get to the actual final game, it takes a little more work from everybody involved to get it that far. So yeah, we'll keep it to what's happening.
Yeah, that's a topical metaphor.
There we go. That should have been better. I should have thought of that one earlier, but yeah, you're right. That makes more sense this time. But yeah, I guess in terms of of that work, I mean, you mentioned the issues with OSS, BSS, things around the edges. I mean, are those things that need to be tackled before an operator can probably go with a commercial type of deployment, or do you think that that they could feel comfortable deploying what's out there today without having all those details finalized? And is that something they can just kind of do later down the road, or I guess should they be comfortable doing it today with where we are in terms of the development of all this today?
I think it's a function of scale.
Okay.
In telco, we've been really good at getting away with deploying standalone silos for small portions of our business. When you want something to become mainstream, then you have to integrate into the mainstream systems. Just to pick the simplest example, you can't send the customer a separate bill for their virtualized services versus their mainstream services. You got to integrate the billing, which there's part of the BSS thing. If the order that the customer is placing is in part fulfilled by a virtualized service and in part is fulfilled by a traditional service,
Mm-hmm.
how do you integrate those two things together and ensure that both parts of the order complete before you start billing the customer? And all of those transactional kind of day-to-day business things are where that integration to the rest of the business needs to happen.
Interesting. Yeah, those seem like they're almost kind of mundane, but they really are where the revenue generation kind of comes from. I mean, if you can't bill for a service, it's kind of hard to offer that service. So that's kind of an important part of it.
It's kind of problematic if you can't bill for it.
Exactly.
And there's been lots of workarounds in the history of the telephone company. I remember well using the pink Princess phone code for a high-speed broadband circuit because we weren't selling Princess phones anymore, so we just reused the code. But that's a workaround, and in the long run, you really got to fix the core business flows and make it all work together.
Yeah, and again, this is such a transformational type of operation to a telecom operator that it is, it's such a big challenge for these guys that they do. I'm sure I can understand their trepidation in going down some of these roads, but it's so needed too. I mean, again, you look at kind of the movements towards 5G in the mobile space and IoT across the whole telecom space, and it seems like those types of services are going to rely so heavily on an operator having a virtualized core. I mean, a lot of their virtualization, a lot of operations virtualized to be able to handle what's coming down the road. That it's like this parallel track of these two racing things going on, and obviously, but you need them both to make them both successful. It's kind of an interesting dynamic in the market today, it seems.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. I mean, 5G to a large extent is predicated on having virtualized, NFV working.
Yeah.
Particularly the virtualized network functions. IoT to a lesser extent. I mean, people tend to lump IoT and 5G together, and the reality is IoT's been here for a decade. I mean, does your car have telematics in it? That's IoT.
Yeah.
So
we used to call it machine to machine back in the day. Remember that? It was always so fun.
Right.
And telematics, all those good names.
Right. I mean, all those great terms, and guess what? It's just IoT.
Yeah.
And if it's not a bad thing, but it's just IoT is already here, and it's just simply the next generation or the next set of services that are going to be part of that hierarchy.
Yeah. I'm guessing most IoT services that are used today could probably rely on a CD-PD network and be just fine. They really don't need these high-speed networks. They just need a basic connection, and that's kind of all they really need. So, but yeah, that's a good point there. So,
well, I mean, 5G is going to be necessary when we get large-scale sensor networks. Yeah, because what 5G brings us is the capacity side of things. IoT is also increasingly going to go into real-time remote type things. And the example I like to use is remote surgery. So you maybe remember A year or so ago, there was a scientist in Antarctica
Hmm.
who needed surgery, and they had to send a plane in very hazardous conditions in order to rescue the scientists and allow her to have the surgery she needed. Um, if you had had a 5G, low latency, high bandwidth network connection, perhaps that surgery could have been done remotely by a surgeon 1,000 miles away. On the other hand, if somebody's going to go into mining with a scalpel and they're remote, I want to make sure that network works.
Yes. That's a good point. That's a good point. I think occasionally whenever I have my phone itself and it kind of drops the connection or the speed slows down quite a bit, that's always one of those situations where you're like, that's okay for now, and I'm just trying to check Facebook or something like that. But yeah, if there's a knife near my knee, I don't necessarily want that happening. So
Yeah, well, and obviously knee surgery is one that's pretty widely available, but
yeah,
it depends upon what the surgery is,
yeah.
whether, this might be a very valid use case. And there are other, remote robot control type things. I can imagine, for example, cleaning up the nuclear disaster in Japan,
Yeah.
sending robots in and controlling them remotely. And a 5G network might be a way to do that more efficiently.
Yeah.
But once again, you want to make darn sure that thing's going to work.
Yeah,
So
that's an important part of it. Yeah, exactly. So I guess maybe getting back a bit on the kind of where we see virtualization in 2017. So what would you expect to see in terms of maybe some of those commercial deployments this year? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of talking to carriers, talking to vendors out there, the ones that are out there, kind of what you're seeing in terms of what we should expect to be some of those initial deployments? I think we're seeing some virtual EPCs or virtual CPEs at this point. But I guess what are you guys seeing as perhaps being some of the initial use cases this year?
Well, I just came back from Mobile World Congress a few weeks ago, and one of the announcements we made there was one of our customers, CableNet, who is going to be deploying a virtualized IMS with with the virtualized app server, so that they can do a virtualized VoLTE environment on top of their LTE. So, there's an example of, it's actually VoLTE and voice over Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an example of somebody taking advantage of virtualization to be able to deploy these things efficiently. Another thing we announced at Mobile World Congress is a partnership with Tech Mahindra, who's a large systems integrator in the telecom space. And what we've announced with them is a cloud-based VoLTE in a box. One of the interesting factoids is that there, of the roughly 500 LTE networks in the world, only 100 of them have VoLTE. The other 400 don't. And when you talk to operators, why don't you have VoLTE up? To a large extent, it's because it's hard. It requires skills that, IT skills, it requires integration skills, it requires a whole set of skills that are a scarce commodity within their business. And the people they have that have those skills are busy. So the idea behind this partnership with Tech Mahindra is to allow a virtualized IMS, virtualized VoLTE app server, to integrate to a customer's existing RAN and run remotely in a Tech Mahindra data center, or if the customer prefers, we can install it in their data center. But either way, it's a pre-integrated stack with all of the pieces ready to go, and hopefully overcoming many of the integration challenges that these carriers are facing, which is keeping them in the 80% that doesn't have VoLTE.
Yeah, that's a great factor, because I think VoLTE is a great example of, you're right, of a way to kind of deploy a service that does have a lot of tricky parts to it. I think people just assume, hey, it's just an LTE service, no big deal. But when you get voice, voice is a tricky thing, and voice over data, I think we've all had connections using a VoIP service or whatever, and it's tricky to do that. So to have that kind of quality of service with a VoLTE connection does require a pretty advanced type of platform to kind of handle that. So that's a great example of companies doing that. It's good to hear the companies are actually starting to roll out with that now too. So I know last year I talked to some companies and they were looking at doing that, and that was kind of a good use case. But actually here now that's starting to happen. That's good to hear. It sounds like that's some good progress happening in the market today. So.
Yeah, no, I think we're actually making real progress in that area, and I think that'll be one of the big forward trends of 2017 will be, in particular, sort of that layer of the overall LTE VoLTE solution becoming a virtualized component, becoming, if it's not NFV, if it's in the cloud. Most of our carriers, are kind of more interested in getting the service up and running and getting the revenue versus maybe the purist of whether the NFV-based deployment is running in their data center or in Tech Mahindra's.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess I was asking about that. I mean, how important is kind of the growing use of cloud by a lot of operators? I mean, is that a positive for the NFV, for the continued evolution of NFV, or is that, I mean, how do those two kind of work together? Because it does seem like operators are becoming more comfortable with running. Obviously, they have their own private clouds, work with a lot of companies, but also the public cloud as well. Is that movement towards cloud helping the process when it comes to the NFV, SDN kind of stuff, or is it getting in the way? What's your, I guess, your view on that part?
I think maybe we need to start with the definition of terms.
Probably good term. Yeah.
Because, what is NFV? Well, it's when you are running network functions as a virtualized set of features, and you have the ability to manage those things automatically or autonomously via some form of orchestration. Well, if you stop the definition after virtualized network functions, that's been going on in telcos for a decade. The telco app servers that have been around for the last 10 years have all run on virtual machines. Oracle's own PCRF has a VM inside. So there are plenty of examples of network functions that have run on a VM historically.
Okay.
And so is that cloud because it predated NFV? I don't know. I mean, it becomes a little bit of a semantic game.
Yeah.
I think what really is important is not so much whether we call it NFV or we call it cloud, whether it runs on-prem or runs in somebody else's data center. The important thing is we're bringing the speed and agility and the cost savings that was really the overall goal of NFV when we got started. And so I think the movement towards cloud is movement towards NFV. I'm not sure there's a huge distinction, and we maybe are getting into the semantics more than the labels.
Yeah, that's probably true. I should probably stay out of those issues because I think it just goes a little over my head at that point too. So yeah, it's probably best just to kind of keep those together, not try to break those apart. But it does seem like again, most operators are on board with a lot of this, and so I guess that's the positive thing is that I think the operators realize that they have to go down these roads. It's going to be maybe painful at times, but it's stuff that they kind of have to do. And it seems like at least from the vendor community as well that the support is growing for that too. I know obviously with Oracle, you guys are doing quite a bit in the space. A lot of vendors are really getting more involved in it. Does it seem like behind the scenes that the vendor community is working pretty well in terms of the interoperability challenges too? Because I know that's always been a bit of an issue. I know operators are trying to get out of the whole vendor lock model. That's been the legacy of telecom. Is the kind of behind the scenes work in terms of making sure everything kind of works together? Is that progressing, do you think, at a pretty good pace as well?
I think it's patchy. I think there are some situations where it works better than others. The forcing function with interoperability is there's sort of two levels of interoperability. There's the marketing interoperability, which is where you make it all work well enough that you can put it on the data sheet. And then there's can you make it all work well enough that it can support 10 million concurrent users. Yeah. The latter is a much more rigorous test, and that only really happens at the operators.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's nice to have some operators, obviously the ones who are kind of leading the space, at least being somewhat aggressive, or at least being out front in terms of kind of describing what they want and what they need. So I guess that's good to have them trying to keep everybody in line, I guess, or at least on the same page. I guess that's probably a positive through all this. Again, it does seem like there are so many companies playing in the space now that to keep all those cats herded into the same into the right direction is a big challenge for somebody. Someone's got to take control of all that.
Yeah, no, I think NFV has definitely been one of these initiatives that originated with the service providers and has largely been driven by the service providers. And as a result, the vendors have been responding. But the leadership has come in many ways from the service providers, and I think that's been a good thing for the industry. It hasn't always been that way in telecom, where the standards and the next generation is driven by the operators.
Yeah. And it does seem like too that the operators seem okay at this point to allow some of their larger vendor partners to kind of help drive that as well. I mean, they're, I know talking to like the AT&Ts of the world and Telefonicas, I mean, they're always a bit, I mean, they don't want to kind of be driving it if they don't have to, but they want to be comfortable with their partners that they've worked with for a long time to perhaps take up the reins a bit and kind of help drive that as well. So it does seem like there's at least some good cooperation happening amongst the carriers and vendors, which is pretty traditional, but it's good to kind of see.
I think that's been a good sign. And I think one of the other good signs I've seen is there's been a lot less focus on ecosystems over the last, say, 6 to 9 months. In the early days of NFV, the model seemed to be large NEP defines themselves as the center of the universe, picks up a number of partners who they certify as being part of their ecosystem, and declares victory, which works great as long as the center of the universe is what you want. The CSPs have, kind of moved beyond that, and they're really looking for true multi-vendor interoperability without anybody being center of the universe. They're really letting the sun revolve around the service provider rather than around a single vendor. And that's been, I think, a positive thing for the industry.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know when I first kind of started covering this space 2.5, 3 years ago now, it did seem like that first year or so was just all these different companies coming out with, hey, we've got this great ecosystem, we got these great partners. And it seemed okay at the time because no one was really sure what they were doing anyway. But it did seem to go against a bit of what the whole movement towards virtualization was about, which was trying to break away from that. So that's a good point. That, it does seem like at least they were getting out of that model now. So.
Yeah, no, I think we've moved on and beyond that, and it was probably a necessary place for us to be.
Yeah.
But now, you're seeing a much more heterogeneous environment.
Yeah, definitely. Well, obviously, you talked a bit about what you expect in 2017. I guess looking ahead, I mean, what do you expect, even looking further down the road there? I mean, are you expecting 2018 to be just a continuation of everything, or do you think there's another significant milestone that perhaps will be reached over the next 18, 20, 24 months at this point?
I might go a little further out than that. I don't want to put a hard time frame on it, but I think one of the things we will see, despite my comment earlier about cloud versus NFV, I think one of the things we are going to start to see, maybe more than a year or two out, but at some point in the not too distant future, will be the integration of public cloud into the service delivery of the telecom operators. So I think of NFV predominantly as being a on-prem within the control of the service provider kind of deployment model. Mm-hmm. And I think what we will see, if I'm being, prognosticating a little bit, is we'll see some of those functions begin to drift into a public cloud kind of deployment model, particularly in places where the operator perhaps doesn't have reach and they're looking to get data center coverage of an area with close proximity. Because one of the issues we'll run into with 5G, I'm rambling here, but
no.
One of the issues we're going to run into with 5G is latency.
Yeah.
It's one of the key benefits. It's not going to be in the first generation of 5G, but one of the things that we're really striving for is reducing latency. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you have to move network functionality out towards the edge of the network. And if you're going to do that ubiquitously, there are going to be places where you don't have a data center, where you don't have a suitable place to run that logic far enough out of the edge. And that's where I can see us beginning to see public cloud drifting into this equation.
Interesting. So the public cloud deployment would basically become that virtualized data center, and you can have those pretty much in someone's house if you really need. I mean, you can have them almost anywhere you need.
They could be wherever they need to be. They can augment the private cloud deployment, or in the case of perhaps a smaller operator who doesn't want to deal with a lot of the complexities, they might actually be something that runs their entire network other than the physical, the RAN or the physical network.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that totally makes a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, I think there's probably still some, hardening of some systems to make all that work. But that latency issue, like you said, is key to all of this. And that's kind of the only way to really tackle it, is to get those data center or whatever's going to be a data center out to the edge as far as you can. That's
as far as you possibly can. And also this stuff is going to remain, there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And so I can see operators wanting to move away from having to have that expertise in-house and being able to deploy that into a public data center.
Yeah.
So but I mean, I think we're a year or two away from that. I think it'll be an interesting trend to watch if you're looking for something a little further out. It'll be NFV on public cloud.
Yeah, interesting. That's a good, interesting topic to watch. And again, it does seem like a very complicated process and a lot's going to happen. But, the way you describe it, it kind of makes sense on what you need to do. So, unless something else revolutionary happens that we don't know about, I guess that's kind of the way we're going to have to kind of evolve this whole network situation out. So,
I mean, that's what we always have to do. Something always does come along that we didn't anticipate. So that's what keeps this job interesting.
Yeah, that's for sure. And for the media, it keeps it fun to cover. At least for me, I enjoy covering it because of that. But that's always fun to watch too. But again, Chris, we always appreciate the good insight. It's good to get kind of an update on where we are today and obviously where we could be going with all this. So we definitely appreciate getting insight from you and from Oracle on the topic. And again, your expertise and your history in the industry is always a welcome addition and viewpoint on the show as well. So we always appreciate that too. So again, thanks so much for the time today, and hopefully we'll touch base again soon. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check out our next NFV SDN Reality Check when we speak with the TM Forum on open APIs and how they will be used to accelerate a recently announced MEF partnership. Thanks for watching.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com, and on Twitter @Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.